Assalamu alaikum and blessings to all. My name is Sharik Abdul Ghani and I am the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is multi-faith and civic engagement. Today, we're talking about the situation our friends in tribal communities face and how they've been completely ignored by our government. It's not an issue we Houstonians talk about much, primarily because, well, there aren't any large tribal communities in the greater Houston area. But it's something we should talk about and amplify in our discussions. Indigenous people have, to say it lightly, haven't been treated well historically, as well as in the present day. And one leader above all has been standing for the rights of Indigenous people consistently and has been especially outspoken during this time. And that is Congresswoman Holland of New Mexico, who, by the way, was one of the first Native Americans elected to Congress, and who also recently co-authored an editorial in the Washington Post with Senator Warren of Massachusetts. And in it, they write, "The coronavirus has taken a tragic toll on Indian country. The Navajo Nation has infection rates higher than any state as of last week. In New Mexico, Native Americans make up just 11% of the population, but account for more than half of the COVID-19 cases." Joining me today is Legislative Counsel Heidi Cheney, and we'll be joined later by Sofia Sanchez, who is also the Senior Field Representative. Thank you for being with us here today, Heidi. Start off with just a quick introduction.
Hi, I'm Heidi Cheney. I'm Legislative Counsel for Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico District 1. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. I'm from New Mexico, where I attended undergrad and law school. And before being pulled over to Congresswoman Haaland's team, I practiced medical malpractice in New Mexico and also previously worked for my tribe, again, Navajo Nation, to work on state and federal governmental relations. So thank you so much for having me here today.
No, we're terrifically happy for you to be here. And as I was mentioning to you before, in the Muslim community, specifically in Houston, there isn't much conversation regarding what our friends in tribal communities face. And we hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation, so we can learn more. And the only way we can advocate and stand with others is if we learn more about the situations they're facing. So just to open it up, Heidi, could you tell us a little bit more, give us some more background on problems facing tribal communities? And I mean, generally speaking, not necessarily related to Corona.
Yeah, I think you did a great introduction in introducing some of the chronic problems that have been facing Indian country, which was highlighted in the United States Commission on Civil Rights report that was published. It was called the Broken Promises Report. It was published in December of 2018. And so that goes through different federal funding shortfalls in Indian country that was made on behalf of the 574 federally recognized tribes that we have today. And those agreements and that federal funding just basically comes from the promises that were made in the treaties with different Native nations from the country, for the loss of lives through genocide and the loss of land that Native Americans had suffered, with basically the establishment of the United States, and the colonists had previously come over. And so that the Broken Promises report that the Civil Rights Commission published basically just goes through and identifies education, public safety, economic, housing, and health disparities throughout Indian country, and how the federal funding shortfalls have basically put Indian country farther behind. And so the recent letter that Congresswoman, my boss, Deb Haaland, had written with Senator Warren and published earlier this week, basically asked the commission to re-up those findings and how the COVID crisis has put Indian country farther behind during the pandemic.
Here in Houston, well, here in Texas, we all have a pretty uniform public education system in the state. We learn so much about issues that have faced tribal nations in the past, and it's always about the past. It's always, pre-1920s. We learn just this, I guess, the stereotypical education about the Trail of Tears, what happened during the Civil War, the story of Thanksgiving, just to take it back a little bit more. We hear about this contention and this conflict between settlers and native nations. And it's always spoken of as if it's the past. So the Trail of Tears is the past, the injustices and the reservations are of the past. But from what you're saying and from what I've read about what Congresswoman Holland is talking about and some of the brief research that we've done is this doesn't seem to be an issue of the past. This really seems to be an issue of the present. We're just dealing with it in a completely different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the issue, and I think that's also why my boss Deb Haaland has been so impactful in Congress during the 116th Congress. It's been over 200 years since it's the first time in over 200 years since Congress has been established that there's been any sort of representation by Native American women. She was elected along with Therese Davids in Kansas, who's a federally recognized member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so them being able to highlight these issues on a national scale has really made a huge difference in tribal communities. Our families, both Representative Holland, who's a member of the Pueblo Laguna, and then myself, member of Navajo Nation, our families are from the reservation. And so some of the issues that the Congresswoman really works on to highlight are issues that, we've all experienced and continue to experience in our families. And I think that has just made, her work on these issues just that much more impactful and important. And, trying to get that message out to different communities. It's a little bit of a challenge, but I think she's making some really great headway because I think a lot of people can relate. The Congresswoman, she grew up on food stamps. She was a single mother. She was homeless at one point, and always have really had to struggle in that way as well. And so for her to be able to highlight these issues, especially with the help of Senator Warren and other congressional leaders like Representative Tom Cole, who's the Republican co-chair of the Congressional Native American Caucus, has made all the difference in the world.
Are we seeing issues related to indigenous peoples and tribal communities? Are we seeing this as a bipartisan issue, or is it very much a partisan issue right now?
It's completely bipartisan. It's always going to be bipartisan. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States across multiple states. Every one of those sovereign nations, they have different political makeup. And, I always say that tribes don't have the luxury of being partisan, no matter what administration it is, no matter what leadership is elected to that tribe or pueblo. It's always important everybody remains bipartisan so everybody can have a unified voice.
You said something so important that tribes don't have the luxury of being partisan, and we say that often in the Muslim community. We can't just be Republican, we can't be Democrat, we can't be Libertarian, this or that. We can't just be in one camp or the other. In order to have a seat at the table, in order to be a part of the conversation, instead of being the topic of conversation, is that we have to have our feet and our presence in each camp. Sure that our voices are heard and our issues are advocated for. Heidi, you had mentioned the amount of tribal nations or the amount of sovereign nations in the United States. Do they have representation in Congress?
Well, because all the tribes are located in different states, it kind of boils down to who their state representatives are within that specific district or within that state. And so that's where folks should be going for representation. I think, again, with my boss and Representative Therese Davids being the first Native women elected to Congress in over 200 years, I also has been a unique experience for our office because there's been an outpouring of support from across the country, which is a little abnormal for a freshman office. But, I think it means a lot for our community to finally see that we have representation at the federal level for the first time. So that's been really, really cool to see.
I remember when Keith Ellison was elected, and then Ilhan Omar was elected, and Rashida Tlaib was elected, and Ben Carson went from state representative to Congress. And it's just this feeling, this surge of joy within our communities. I'm not saying it validated us or it was a mark of we made it as a community, but it was wonderful to see that our community members were represented in the halls of Congress, and that they have a voice, and them having a voice, even though they're not from Houston, meant in a way that I have a voice and that my children have a voice, and it provides a path forward because someone has to break that ceiling. Someone has to break that ceiling. And it looks very much like.
I'm so sorry.
No, I was thinking it looks very much like Congresswoman Holland is breaking that ceiling, along with her colleagues.
Yeah, and I think it's just so important to have that voice that, regardless of, whether you're a part of a singular community, I think it's important for all minorities to have a voice and make sure that, everybody can relate to, because I think a lot of people can relate to these issues. It's not like, the poverty and inequalities specific to Indian country. I mean, I think all of our communities have really seen that at every single level. So I think it's just the more, folks that we can get into Congress or other elected positions that, everybody can identify with, I think the country just benefits as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Congresswoman Holland really caught our attention a few weeks ago when she was advocating for tribal communities, and she was saying something that just shocked us, and that was, of the money that was allocated to our country from the CARES Act, not a single dime until recently, I think it was about a week ago, didn't receive a single dime of the CARES Act. And it's just, I had my stimulus money, but my friends in tribal nations had absolutely nothing, and there was nothing in sight. And from everything that we read and heard from politicos, it was essentially, there was pushback from the federal government on giving tribal communities their right, something that was already passed. It was pushed into law, and then they weren't getting a dime of it. And so that's how Congresswoman Holland really caught our attention. And this is really a reason why we're here today, is to learn more about this continued injustice towards our friends in tribal communities. Could you speak a little bit more and give us a little bit more background on what was going on with the CARES Act and why Congresswoman Holland was advocating?
Well, I think, just generally, obviously, I don't think that anybody's been through a national pandemic before. And so there's been so many times that tribes have been left behind, and just communities of color really have just been left behind. Again, it goes back to having a voice in important elected positions, and also getting people out to vote. But with specifically to the CARES Act, that was kind of an eye opener even within our own office in negotiating the CARES Act, the economic relief stimulus packages. You saw billions of dollars going out to airline companies and different businesses. The states, of course, were already covered, and it was a struggle to even get money included. And the Congresswoman really worked hard to get that $8 billion included into the CARES package. Originally, they had requested $20 billion for 574 tribes, not just a company or two or three, 574 different tribes with different economic, backgrounds. And so by the time that had gotten to the White House, they zeroed out that amount. And it was like the Congresswoman was having to get so many people, like almost like across both chambers, on board, Republican, Democrat leaders, to help get that money included back into the CARES Act package, that we finally saw the $8 billion get across the finish line. But even till today, a lot of the money hasn't been distributed. There's still 4.2 that has been held up in the courts from some of the administrative issues with including tribal corporations, which took that 574 federally recognized tribes to, I think it was over 600 or so extra folks to help give money out to by including tribal corporations, which aren't sovereign governments. So that money is still being held up in court today. And then as we move forward, it feels like it's been, a struggle at every avenue because of the interpretation that the administration's taken. And instead of getting money and PPE and different supplies out, mitigation teams from the CDC out to tribal communities, tribes have continued to be left behind, and it's just been a fight at every single level, which is what she continues to work on.
Heidi, if Congresswoman Holland wasn't there, who'd be advocating for tribal nations in the halls of Congress?
I think, in the state of New Mexico, Senator Udall, who's the vice chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, has always been a really strong advocate for Indian country. We have Chairman Grijalva, who's the Arizona representative, and he's the chair of the whole House Committee on Natural Resources, along with Chairman Ruben Gallego, also of Arizona, who's the chairman of the subcommittee on indigenous people. And then also, Representative Tom Cole, who's Republican, co-chair of the Congressional Native American Caucus. They have been really great throughout this whole process, and working with my boss, but even before my boss was sworn into Congress. They've been really great advocates for Indian country, but I just think it makes a little bit more of an impactful difference when you have people from your own community advocating on these.
Absolutely, because you understand the nuances, you understand the narratives, and especially with Congresswoman Holland's background and the way she grew up, it's hard to internalize the struggle unless you experience it firsthand. As legislative counsel, you not only look at policy, but you help write policy, you oversee it, you consult on it. What are some of the hurdles, or what are some of the hurdles that you faced to ensure tribal communities are taken care of? And just to clear this with our viewers, Congresswoman Holland is not a congresswoman for just the Navajo people or the tribal nations. She's a congresswoman she's a representative for all in her district. But because of her unique background, we know that this is something that's near and dear to her. So what are some of the biggest hurdles you're facing to ensure tribal communities are taken care of?
I think one of the biggest challenges that our office or any office faces doing that work on Indian country issues is that you're already starting behind. And I know that that's a mantra that keeps getting repeated, but when you look at issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women and these jurisdictions, these like really detailed and intricate legal jurisdictional issues between Indian country, public safety, who has jurisdiction to police the boundaries between reservations, between state and local governments, in trying to locate missing and murdered women when you have such a short, you have like a 48-hour period to find a missing person generally. And when you don't have data, when you don't have internet or broadband or telephone services, which many Native communities don't, especially in New Mexico, then it's basically, you're starting from scratch of not only jurisdictional complications that the local authorities and tribal police don't understand or know. Federal agencies don't understand that sometimes. But then also you add poverty on top of that. You add lack of broadband communication services on top of that. And the issues just sometimes seem to compound, whereas you wouldn't find that so much in an urban setting. And so I think, there's multi-layered issues. And so that's probably been one of the hardest things to try to work on legislation and be impactful when, you have different layers to address.
Heidi, you said lack of communications, no broadband. Some places don't have phone service. And we know that the Indian healthcare system is chronically underfunded. How has this impacted tribal nations during Corona, especially when communication is key to survival?
I think, it's all about spectrum access, and tribes have faced barriers at the FCCs in trying to get spectrum access to set up digital networks. And so that's created huge monumental barriers that were already an issue before, but when the COVID crisis hit, it made it even more difficult to get telehealth services, to call. In some areas, you just cannot get cell phone service because there's no wireless networks available. And so you have people that are unnecessarily dying or trying to get life-saving services and cannot get access to any services like you would in any metropolitan area. And so, Navajo Nation now has the highest rate of coronavirus cases above New York and New Jersey now per capita. And so part of these issues on top of, not getting mitigation or pre-acceleration teams from the CDC to help, mitigate the COVID, the virus, has been an extremely complicated issue. Kids can't get a hold of broadband services at, the Bureau of Education, Indian education schools or tribal colleges, which has made, again, things a lot more complicated. So it puts everybody even further behind.
Heidi, your background is Navajo.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How has this impacted you? I mean, you've mentioned that the Navajo Nation is facing the highest per capita infection rates, more than New York, you just said. And we know New York is an absolute disaster, not in terms of the organization from the government, but in terms of how Corona has affected the people and the economy and the livelihood. How has this impacted you, your family? How has this impacted the Navajo Nation?
I would like to tell everybody on the call, always be nice to the congressional staffers, because not only is it, you're dealing with these issues, and there's immense pressure to get a lot of things passed and, cleared out. But on a personal level, my own family and, they don't have access to telephone services or broadband because of the area of the reservation that they live in. And so that's been really difficult. And then just knowing how the health facilities work out there, and knowing the lack of resources there are. CNN just did like a whole like a intensive interview and showing that one of the IHS facilities in one of the more populated areas of Navajo Nation, which is the size of West Virginia, has 6 hospital beds. And so knowing that your family's in an area that's severely underfunded, lacking resources, and they also don't have access to telehealth services or running water, or electricity. Some days is a little bit harder than others, but I feel very honored and privileged to be able to be working on these issues for the Congresswoman, because I know how important they are to both of us, and then also, other congressional leaders, to help get things across the finish line, because it impacts our families personally.
Yeah. You mentioned CNN just did some reporting on it. Correct me if I'm wrong, I just don't feel people really know what tribal nations are facing during Corona. It seems worse than a pandemic for tribal nations. It seems almost a catastrophe. If you're saying that the Indian healthcare system is so underfunded, complete lack of communication, 6 hospital beds? You actually said 6 hospital beds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why is it that tribal nations are facing such issues?
It goes back to the Broken Promises report that the U.S. Civil Rights Commission on Civil Rights had published. It's this chronic lack of underfunding, especially with healthcare in Indian country, which in 2017 they found that per person per capita for healthcare in the United States is about $9,000, almost $10,000 per person. And for healthcare, for IHS services, Indian healthcare services in Indian country, the funding per person is about $3,300. And so when you're starting from these immense disparities and you're getting funded at approximately a third of the funding than the average American, then you're obviously going to run into some issues. The GAO also just recently found that the Indian healthcare services. 50% of the rural locations are either operating on an extremely low, it's like 3 megabits of broadband service, which is basically dial-up, or they just have unreliable access to broadband services. And so there's just, it's, at that point, it's like, what's the point of even having, broadband services if it doesn't work or it's slow? It's so slow you can't upload information. So
tell us what your slate of legislative priorities look like. And please include the CARES Act for specifically as it relates to tribal nations.
Are you for the upcoming or for previously? Okay.
No, for upcoming.
Okay,
What are issues that we as a Muslim community or we as a people can advocate for our friends in tribal nations?
I think well, right now the HEROES Act was passed out of the House last week. And so that had some great protections and increased, healthcare funding and economic stimulus funding for Indian country. The work that we really need to get done is, helping tribes get access to spectrum on tribal lands to set up their own networks. That's a huge, huge initiative of the Congresswoman. And also just making sure that that funding that was passed in the HEROES Act stays intact and makes it through the Senate.
Why wouldn't it stay intact?
I'm sorry?
Why wouldn't it stay intact? That sounds like a silly question. Yeah. I know. But if you could clarify that for our viewers, why wouldn't funding for people who are having it the worst, why would that just be gutted from the bill?
Well, the Senate is Republican majority, and so their priorities are different over there. Just by nature of it being a separate chamber, they're going to have different initiatives to move forward on their end, and so that's why it's so important to try to get some of the funding initiatives that the House leadership helps get in, to keep Indian country funded through this crisis over there too.
Where can we learn about these legislative priorities? Is there a website that we can go to? Should we go to Congresswoman Holland's website?
Yeah, I mean, everything that the Congresswoman, publishes or puts out, it is on the press site on the website. And so you can look at it that way. Indians.com is a really good native news outlet that really tracks quite what all the congressional leaders and what initiatives are coming out of Congress, and then also what's being litigated in the judicial branch, which is just like a good overview of everything going on for Indian country. So,
and that leads me to my next question: are there any organizations that you would direct us to? And I say this because as I had mentioned before, we in Houston don't necessarily have an attachment to tribal communities. I read all the time on Reddit about stories that happen on reservations, things that affect reservations, and it almost seems to be an entirely different world with even the terminology and the vocabulary, the lexicon itself seems to be different. And I feel because we're in Houston, we're so detached from that. However, we know that there are tribal nations in the state of Texas, but they're just not around our city. How can we Houstonians learn more about what our friends in tribal communities faced? You mentioned one resource was Indians.com. You also mentioned Congresswoman Holland's website and her Facebook page. What are other ways that we can learn more? Are there videos, movies, documentaries, news websites specific to tribal nations?
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, Indians.com, it's with a Z on the end, and I know that's like a little bit of a different spelling, but just note that. But the National Congress American Indian, NCAI.org, they have all the updated legislative information as well, policy information. They are one of the folks that we reach out to quite a bit. The National Indian Health Board here in DC also is the specialist on the healthcare in Indian country, who's also, we work with pretty frequently, have great information on that. Twitter is always a good, our stuff is good information.
Twitter might get censored now. Twitter might not have any protections.
We fact check our stuff. I look through all of our stuff on the Congresswoman's end, so you can double check our stuff, and if it's wrong, please email us. But just some. Oh, Native News Online is also a really great. Indian Country Today. There's a lot of great news outlets, but those are some of the main ones that would be good just to keep up with the daily happenings of what's happening legislatively, and then also any litigation moving forward.
Just in parting, Heidi, you've been such a great guest. I appreciate all the information that you shared with us, and we know that this is a tremendously difficult time, and it's also a tremendously busy time. Could you give us a couple of takeaways, something that you feel that we absolutely must know, and one action item?
I'm just going to repeat something that the Congresswoman is extremely passionate about, and that's, making sure everybody in any community gets out to vote on this next election, and how important it is to make sure that, you have the information that you need. And if you don't, you can find somebody that has it, to make sure that we get people out. I think this next election is one of the most important ones that we're going to see in possibly even our lifetime. So I think that is a huge issue. And then also the federal census count that is ongoing. That is also something that I hope that somebody takes away. And again, I know that's a little bit outside of the Indian country issues that we're discussing today, but the census count and voting, that would make a huge difference in all of our communities. So those are my two takeaways, is to make sure you get people out to do both of those.
And a takeaway for me is to check out Indians.com with a Z. Make sure I like Congresswoman Holland's Facebook page so we can start staying in the loop, subscribing to a couple of newsletters here and there, because we just can't do enough to catch up on the information, because oftentimes we've been fed so much in misinformation, and that's likely because we just don't have any contact with tribal nations. Here in the city. We're joined.
One more thing I would like to just plug for my communications director, to just make sure to get on the Rep Deb Holland's Twitter, and then our Facebook page as well. So thanks.
Good, and we'll make sure that we push that out in our comments as well, and the newsletter when we send it out. We're joined today with Heidi Cheney, who is the legislative counsel for Congresswoman Holland of New Mexico, who's been incredibly outspoken for tribal nations, especially now because of Corona, because of the issues they've been facing. We as a Muslim community, in order for us to know others, in order for us to stand for others, we have to be educated so we know how to stand with others. And that's so incredibly important, especially in a time where misinformation is rampant, and also in a time where it's important to be next to one another. And when we stand with others, it not only gives them hope, but it gives us inspiration, and all of us inspiration to do something a little bit more. My name is Sharik Abdul-Ghani. I'm the director of Minaret Foundation, where our focus is multi-faith and civic engagement. Please check out our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll be posting more links that Heidi had mentioned in our talk today in the comment section. Thank you so much. Blessings to all.